And welcome back. So we're up to the 89-90 season. So we're officially into the 90s. Cool. And we will get to why I'm wearing what I'm wearing. Uh, the North Stars make a deal with the incoming Sharks. They're not known as the Sharks yet. In fact, they're just known as the team that's going to the Bay Area. The San Jose Sharks were kind of the replacement for the Oakland Seals. The Oakland Seals failed, but the Guns were bound and determined to eventually make it work, and they get their shot. And a year ahead of San Jose coming in, Minnesota makes some deals. And new general manager Bobby Clark doesn't like those deals. He doesn't like it at all. The idea that San Jose will be able to take players from the Minnesota North Stars, and it will include prospects. So basically, when they became the Minnesota North Stars in '67, that's one Minnesota North Stars creation. But about a decade later, the Cleveland Barons folded after they'd been the Oakland Seals. And when the Cleveland Barons folded, all of their players went into the Minnesota organization. So a little over a decade later, when San Jose's coming in, Minnesota's kind of dispersed in order to give players to San Jose. And it's just as confusing as it sounds. And I remember it. I remember that expansion, and I remember thinking, this is really bizarre. I was also underwhelmed by the players that they got from Minnesota. But Bobby Clark was not happy with the idea that he was going to lose players. And not only that, but you know the rule we have now about players having to have played a certain amount of games in the league before they're eligible for expansion or for expansion draft. So Minnesota going into this season had certain prospects they didn't want to lose, and they knew that if they played them that season, they'd lose them in the expansion draft. That handcuffed them that season. But that being said, they did not have a great season in 89-90, and then Jack Ferrara leaves to go to San Jose, so their general manager goes, I'll go to that team that's not named and doesn't have a city yet. See you, Minnesota. So the North Stars bring in Bobby Clark, which isn't going to work for long or well, but it's this weird mishmash going on with Minnesota. While attendance is not great, fan excitement is almost nil, and Norm Green is about to become one of the most hated sports figures in Minnesota history. The collective bargaining agreement will expire in 1991, and unrest is on the horizon. This is where you start hearing about, well, this player's making this much. Why is that player making that? Well, why isn't this guy making more? And really, owners are really, really cheap. We'll get to that now, actually. Because Brett Hull goes from $125,000. He made $125,000 the year he had over 70 goals. And then he gets a raise to $1.8 million from the St. Louis Blues. And they're big spenders. They go out and they get Scott Stevens. And basically, this is where St. Louis starts spending a bunch of money. Although eventually Adam Oates isn't going to be happy with some things, and Oates is going to find himself on his way out of town. But when Hull goes from 125K to 1.8 million, the statement that I read on it was he's only had one really good season. One superstar season, and now he's worth almost $2 million. We're headed for a lockout or a strike. So there you go. That's where it kind of gets started. The idea that, guy cashed in after one good year, how dare he? But stuff that today we go, yeah, that's how that works. And back then it was, no, you can't do that. That's just not how hockey works. The Calgary Flames have a good season. They don't repeat as Stanley Cup champs. They end up being upset in the first round by the LA Kings, and it is disastrous. That first round is disastrous, and I remember when the Kings knocked them out. As a Canuck fan, I was happy because I felt like, 89 had happened, and I was still mad about that, so, well, they're not going to repeat. And yet, at the same time, I wasn't a big Gretzky fan either, so I was like, I don't... But I honestly was thrilled with that series because there were all kinds of goals scored between those two teams. And they didn't like each other very much either. So there was the right mix of dislike and offense to create a fantastic series. So what happens with the Oilers is the Flames are out in the first round. Thanks, LA. The Oilers then take out LA, the team that took them out the year before. And the LA Kings fall by the wayside and the Oilers move on. for their 5th cup in 7 years. So that's the end of the last official dynasty in the NHL, with the Oilers' 5th cup in 7 years. And Mark Messier wins the Hart. And the conversation becomes this. In a league where we've had these dominant superstars like Lemieux and Gretzky, Messier winning the Hart is kind of seen as a step, not a step down, but a different kind of player being recognized for the Hart. It's not necessarily the guy who's going to go out and score 150 plus points. And the voting is really split. So we come up to where we are now, which is when the Hart Trophy nominees are named. We have no idea. We can have some kind of an educated guess, but we have no idea. Before Messier wins it in 90, you have a pretty good idea who's going to win it when they nominate. Oh, Gretzky's got another. Oh, Lemieux's got another one. So the Winnipeg Jets, after 89-90, they adopt these uniforms. And there's some optimism. There's some optimism that Winnipeg's getting better. But they also traded out Dale Hawerchuk and brought in Phil Housley. So the optimism is there, but the disrespect towards Hawerchuk to me was always kind of, I don't know, and it was there. I've talked to you guys about how he was seen as the biggest whiner and all this. Honestly, I liked Hawerchuk a lot. I thought he was a really great player. And he's in the Hall of Fame now, and it's easy to just look at his stats now and go, yeah, Hall of Famer. But while he was playing, the disrespect was there. LA Kings, or not the LA Kings, not to them yet. Vancouver, 14 straight losing seasons. Yeah. It's a pretty poor standing for the Canucks. In fact, the headline for the Canucks for this season was Doormat Dynasty. And that's pretty accurate. 14 straight seasons below 500. That's insane. Larionov had a decent season as a rookie that year. Krutov was a flop. What happened was that for Krutov and Larionov, these guys have been with Red Army. So the Soviets decided where you ate, what you did. You had no freedom, nothing. You come over to North America and you have some freedoms. You're allowed to do stuff. You're allowed to have some fun. Krutov did not have the discipline when it came to his training, when it came to his diet, and it showed right away. Larionov, he was fine. He had a 44-point rookie season, which wasn't fantastic, but honestly, getting used to a new culture and language and all that other wonderful stuff, he did well. Krutov, I think, had 35 points that year, and Krutov just couldn't keep up. It was obvious right from the get-go that Krutov was going to be the one that struggled, and he would not last. Larionov would, but sadly would not stick around in Vancouver for very long because eventually the Vancouver Canucks would have had to pay Red Army when they renewed his contract. Larionov doesn't like that. Larionov was very outspoken after he left the Soviet Union about how he did not want any more money going to these people, and he was very happy to be over here. The Kings, now we're up to the Kings. Poor regular season, however, they beat the Flames in round 1. So again, we're looking at a team that underachieves during the regular season and does something good in the postseason. We don't see that anymore. Due to the fact that we have only 16 out of 31 teams make the playoffs, and back then it's 16 out of 21. So it would be the equivalent of like 25 teams making the playoffs now. So you have about 6 miss the playoffs. You're going to have upsets. And it's going to give you this false sense of teams having a better season than they did. And that's the case with the Kings, where they underachieved, but they're remembered for upsetting the defending Stanley Cup champion Flames in round 1. Chicago, Mike Keenan becomes coach and general manager after a first-place finish for the Chicago Blackhawks. Absolutely great season for Chicago. And by their standards, it's a great season. It looks like they're building some sustained success with Keenan at the helm. Keenan is a fiery figure and whatnot, but he seems to fit Chicago. As much as he seemed to fit Philly, briefly, he seems to fit the Chicago mold as well. So he's there. Things are going well. They do end up trading out Denis Savard, and we'll get to that when it gets to the Montreal part of things. Toronto, they're finally at 500. For the first time in a long time, they don't lose more games than they win. And they allowed 35 shots per game, so it's a miracle that they were able to score enough to keep up. Because their goals for were up by 78 goals. So they scored 78 more goals than they did the previous season, and they were still allowing 35 shots per game. So the Leafs, their defense not very good, their offense fantastic, middling results in the playoffs. Yeah, that's about right. The difference, of course, is between then and now, 500 team then and now 100-point team. So a little bit different. But the Leafs, some optimism. Vinny Domfus playing pretty well. Detroit, well, Demers is gone. So remember that whole, he's got a 5-year contract and a 3-year act? Yep. Demers was fired after missing the playoffs, and Brian Murray is brought in. So the Detroit Red Wings look in a completely different direction when it comes to coaching. It's not the last coaching change they're going to make. And Jimmy Devellano at this point is shifting things around quite a bit. And there's some criticism out there when it comes to the Red Wings. And the Detroit Dead Things nickname is out there as well. So Detroit got some work to do on that. Buffalo, 98 points, and they lose to Montreal in the first round. So this, again, is that situation that happens when you have rivals playing against each other in the playoffs, I think, more than elsewhere, where, more than if they didn't know each other very well, where you have a really, really good team, but the other team knows how to shut them down. And in Buffalo's case, that's what happened. So 98-point season, excellent year for Buffalo. I think they were 3rd overall, and then Montreal knocks them out in round 1. So Boston, Stanley Cup Finals, but not a lot of punch up front compared to other teams in the league. So it's defense and goaltending that gets them there. Ray Bourque on the blue line, Andy Mogan net, and they get themselves to the finals. But there's still something lacking offensively. So when they do meet Edmonton in the finals, they're overwhelmed by the Oilers. Montreal, they lose to Boston in round 2, which means everybody's got to go. Just kidding, they didn't get rid of everybody. However, they decided they needed some more punch up front. They needed some more offense. So they traded Chris Chelios to the Chicago Blackhawks for Denny Savard. 10 years too late. Denny Savard, of course, could have and should have been a Montreal Canadian back in 1980, but they drafted Doug Wickenheiser, and Savard ended up in Chicago. So this is kind of making up for lost time. Savard's already recorded 1,000 points in the NHL by this time, and he won't get back to those lofty heights scoring-wise that he was at before he was a Montreal Canadian. But he can't qualify it as a complete disappointment, although losing Chelios hurts them because Montreal will win a championship. Not yet, but they will. The Rangers. Something amazing happened that year. I remember Bernie Nichols coming off that 70-goal season, and everybody talking about how great Nichols was. And then all of a sudden he was a Ranger. It was during All-Star weekend. So Nichols ends up a Ranger, and they win the division title for the first time since 1942. So the New York Rangers are toying with being relevant, which they hadn't been under Phil Esposito despite his 43 trades in 3 years. And Nichols, decent-looking addition, but he'll never get back to that scoring level. Nichols kind of bounced around after that. New Jersey, Sean Burke, the hero 2 seasons earlier in their playoffs. They go back to the playoffs. However, Chris Terreri's the starter in the playoffs, and Burke is not happy about it. Burke sees himself as a starter. If they're going to end up going with Terreri as the starter, I'm out of here. And in the minors, you've got, they've just drafted Marty Brodeur. He's going to end up moving his way up pretty quickly. So Sean Burke's time in New Jersey is not nearly as long or as fruitful as might have been expected after that 88 run to the semifinals. Pittsburgh. Well, it's a long list of things that happened with Pittsburgh. First, Mario misses 21 of the last 22 games with back problems. He has surgery in the offseason, which they hope fixes his back. Doesn't. Barrasso misses 2 months of the season due to his daughter having cancer, which does go into remission, and she seems to be recovering. So there's a lot of talk about next year should be better. And the players rebel against Coach Gino Briacco. They can't stand him, so they do what they can to make sure that he gets fired, and he does. And Badger Bob is hired, Bob Johnson. So smart things are happening with Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's in the vicinity of being a contender, even though they missed the playoffs that year. Washington, The Capitals did something amazing in 1990. For the first time in their history, they played games in May. So the reason this mattered is because back in the day, May meant you were in the semifinals, meant you were one of the final four. This was when the Stanley Cup was awarded in mid to late May, not early June. So by playing games in May for the first time, it meant they got to the third round. And the weird thing is, they had the worst regular season they'd had in 8 years. And yet, they made it past 2 rounds of hockey. However, it's all overshadowed by there's a sex scandal that occurs with Dino Ciccarelli, Jeff Courtnall, and Neil Sheehy, which is thrown out of it. It doesn't go anywhere in court. It just kind of gets thrown out, and it definitely cast a shadow over that run. John Druce, that playoff, had 14 goals in 15 playoff games. So that's where John Druce's run comes from, and this is when he sets a standard that he can't reach again. But John Druce, fantastic year, and the Capitals have this great thing happen, and then it's overshadowed by other stuff. This again is where the NHL's party culture is still in the process of changing. I know we still hear about, just last week we heard about a couple guys getting in a bar fight, but it's more rare and it's less severe than it was back then. So a lot of this stuff goes on, and anyways, we'll move on from that because again, it was thrown out of court, nothing, but just the fact that it got there. Islanders, they won their last 2 games to get into the playoffs. Pittsburgh and Philly had to lose their last 2 games for the Islanders to get into the playoffs, and it happened. The Islanders won both, Philly and Pittsburgh lost both, and the Islanders are in the playoffs. They're out in round 1, though. So there's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is the Islanders return to the playoffs with a 73-point record after 61 the year before, so they're getting better and they're in the playoffs. The bad news is they're still out rather gently in round 1. So there's some good pieces with the Islanders. There's some good young talent there, but talks of them building to Dynasty 2 have started to die off. Philly, Clark gets fired. And Bobby Clark gets fired after they missed the playoffs, but ownership says it's not because they missed the playoffs. Yeah, it is. And Paul Holmgren stays as coach. So Holmgren's still going to be there as coach after they don't reach the playoffs. Of course, Paul Holmgren is attached to the Philly organization right up until today. And Bobby Clark does end up going back. So for anybody who goes, well, wait, Clark was always their GM, right? No, he ended up in Minnesota briefly. And it didn't take very long in Minnesota before Bobby Clark decided he would rather be in Philly. I never got the feeling with Minnesota that he really wanted to be. It just didn't feel right that he was not a Minnesota North Star kind of guy. He's a Flyer. Now, to give an example of just how bad this season was for the Nordiques, the Canucks were number 20 in the league of 21 teams. They had 64 points. Quebec had 31. So Quebec, if they had doubled their point total, would have still been the worst team in the league. That's how bad a season it was for the Nordiques. There's already a video on this channel about that truly awful season in 89-90. I don't need to dig all through that stuff again, but it was a miserable season. And Sergei Makarov wins Rookie of the Year for the Calgary Flames, which leads to changing the requirements. Makarov was older, and therefore the NHL looked at it after he won it and said, the Rookie of the Year should be for somebody who's younger, somebody who's brand new. As an example, that same year, Mike Modano was a rookie, scores 75 points. By today's rules, Makarov would have been seen as a good first-year NHLer, but Modano's Rookie of the Year. So that's the last time you're going to see a player who's over the age 27 win Rookie of the Year. And it didn't feel right either. I remember at the time there were a lot of people that thought this is not really what Rookie of the Year is supposed to be. It's supposed to be just, the best kid that's come into the league kind of thing. So there you go. You guys are all caught up on what happened in 1989, 1990. And we'll move on to 1991 and beyond from here. But it was an interesting season. Some big changes going on. And yet, the Oilers are still the Stanley Cup champions. But that's that's the last time that they say that. And it has always felt to me like they've spent the last couple of decades trying to get back to that. And that they put people on the team with the organization who were a part of that, with the idea that we can maybe rebuild using their knowledge of what they did in the 80s, and it just didn't really work. So there you go. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.